Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, Bryan Keene, has edited a new book from Getty Publications called Toward a Global Middle Ages, Encountering the World Through Illuminated Manuscripts. Yes, it's a richly illustrated volume of manuscripts from the period between 400 to 1600, but it's oh so much more than that. We easily could have recorded 4 episodes about the title alone. The words Global, Middle Ages, and Manuscripts are each weighted with their own scholarly backstories and are now subject to a host of new research opportunities and context. It's this contemporary perspective that Bryan brings to his book, which features an incredibly diverse and multidisciplinary group of scholars, each contributing an essay that expands the field of manuscript studies and explodes the notion of a Eurocentric medieval time period. Choice reviewer Lawrence Nees from the University of Delaware calls the book exciting and handsomely produced, and says the essays draw from all over the globe, the New World as well as the Old, and are all beautifully illustrated in color and attempt to address wider concerns. Seldom has this reviewer learned so much and with such pleasure. This is a challenging first attempt at an overview and a great achievement. Through its study and display of manuscripts, the book shows not only what medieval means in a global context, but how interconnected the world actually was during that time. In this final episode of our series with Bryan, who is Associate Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, we talk about how the book came together. And if you've been listening to the last 3 episodes, you'll understand why this part of our conversation is particularly intriguing. The global scale of the book's diverse and inclusive perspective of medieval manuscripts is mirrored in its contributors and the rich collaborative effort that went into producing it. Okay, so I'd like to dive into sort of the process of putting the book together, and you've sort of touched on this several times over the previous episodes, and it sounds like such a sort of rich, complex kind of collaborative effort. And, the ideas that you've aimed to illuminate in the book itself were, in a way, mirrored in the process of putting it together. And as we talked about in sort of this last episode of defining the word global as partly a methodology of inclusion, I'm wondering if you could talk about inclusivity in terms of putting this book together, in terms of who you collaborated with, the range of representation that you wanted to have in the book, and how did you achieve that level of inclusivity?
I think for this, again, it's important that I acknowledge just a few individuals. I could list every single person in the acknowledgement by name because I think
Sure.
all have really helped bring this process together. But I think specifically, Karen Levine in our publication team said, cross those boundaries, choose images from all over the place, and then we'll figure out how that fits within costs and budgets. And we will certainly need to limit, but we don't want you to be limited in thinking about what places and traditions and objects need to be included. And then our editor, Ruth Lane, in Pubs, who worked very closely with me in finalizing the overall structure of the volume, she was really incredible at making sure, if you were to look back on this volume, once it hits the press and comes out in its published form, would you be able to stand by and say, we achieved our goal at having a range of perspectives of, men and women, queer perspectives, a racial makeup of the authorial group, as well as individuals with different ranges in their academic and scholarly careers, but also a diversity in approaches to the history of the book. So not just art historians, but historians of comparative literature, historians, religious specialists, conservators. I mean, all sorts of different approaches. But perhaps foremost among all of these individuals, I should say, is Morgan Conger. She was working in our department as a research assistant and then staff assistant, and now, as I said, special projects administrator for the Getty president, which speaks to her own trajectory. But at every stage, we sat down. It was on a weekly process, looking across the volume and saying, do the images as they're organized represent the world and as many parts of the world as we can? Do the authors, whenever possible, mention women and the contributions of women in history, women scholars? And it was really Morgan who tasked herself with reading deeply across histories and traditions and being very brave to suggest to senior scholars, junior scholars, myself as the editor, that, this section is, male centered. We need to introduce other voices, or even in the images and the captions saying, you highlight the central figure, but you omit in the captioning even other women in the scene or other figures in the scene even. So she especially helped think about that degree of diversity in terms of being transparent about our ideas for the volume, admitting to possible shortcomings or the fact that we couldn't address all things, oral tradition, for example, but then really at every stage saying, will you feel comfortable looking back at this and knowing that you've tried to cross as many boundaries as possible, include as many people as possible? And then it just occurs to me, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Nina Damavandi. She single-handedly acquired the 176 illustrations from over 80 sources that constituted 35 libraries and museums, many of which she had to correspond in a range of languages over a series of months, working, of course, in various currencies. And I cannot even fathom her process. And it was remarkable being able to watch her spreadsheet emerge and evolve. And she worked incredibly fast. It was like around the world in 80 days. She managed to bring these images together in remarkable speed from some places that were incredibly remote, picking up the phone and calling individuals. She's another true champion of this project.
Excellent. So as you mentioned, you were very careful to assemble a group of contributing scholars from a whole range of backgrounds and specialties, and I was just curious, and you've mentioned this earlier. They're scholars in a range of different stages in their careers as well, and I'm wondering what was your reasoning behind that too? Like, why include junior scholars in terms of their contributions to this volume?
Certainly. This I've seen as an approach in a number of fields, this idea of being inclusive across not just the areas of specialization and disciplines, but stages in one's career. I still think of myself as a fairly junior scholar, someone who's been at the Getty now for over a decade, but am still learning so much. And, it was really in working through those study day sessions that I think the core group of the author in the volume, it became clear represented scholars at all of those levels. But because the voices of so many graduate and undergraduate students really helped shape and inform the thinking behind all of these essays, it would have been, I think, unjust to only include voices of established or affiliated scholars even. That I should also mention was not a given. Some of the scholars were not affiliated initially, were working as independent scholars. Some of them are now affiliated, but I think it reveals the tenuous place that we as scholars often have in the broader world, not just in academia, but in our career paths. And also that feeling that there's sometimes maybe a divide or different approaches in the museum or the university setting. And so it was important to bring those worlds together. But then certainly following this sort of mandate and the call by the group known as the Medievalists of Color, that it's important not just to cite women, people of color, emerging and early career researchers, but to involve them in projects from the beginning. And, I have to say there are now 3 journals that represent or that try to bring together global medieval perspectives. And I have to say I've benefited perhaps in seeing the development of those projects and to see the critique and the praise in print and in social media about these projects, and the call again to be transparent, to be inclusive, and then to just be honest that we're trying. Here are our shortcomings, here are our limitations, and we're hoping to continue to learn not just together, but with everyone else that will read and disagree with, or help advance or suggest other routes for moving forward. So that's some of the reasoning behind the process of assembling the authorial team.
Okay, perfect. So the book, I think, has over or more than 11,000 references, and it sounded like there was a pretty epic process behind the editing of that reference list. And I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the decisions that were made to get that list to where it is now and what to include and what not to.
Absolutely. I mean, editing the bibliography was itself a monumentous task
Yeah.
that involved numerous individuals that are all thanked explicitly in the acknowledgments. For us, it really was an act of constantly adding to the bibliography and really working with our designer, Kurt Hauser, who was just phenomenal in every way in designing and laying out the volume in a very beautiful way. But at a certain point, I remember in a meeting him saying, we actually cannot shrink the typeface of the bibliography any further if you want it to be legible. And we're already sort of at the maximum
Right.
page count for the volume. And, we didn't have to cut any of the sources, I'm pleased to say. But initially, I will say in the first
Right.
manuscript submission, a number of the authors had decided to include as many sources in English as possible, realizing that the book was going to be published in English, distributed for an English reading or possibly speaking market. But it was again through that peer review process where one of the peer reviewers was incredibly critical of the fact that we needed to have more inclusive representation of non-English sources. And it was actually really clear that a number of the authors had cited English translations of works that existed in original languages. And so I insisted that they return to those original first edition or first publication, even if it was in a different language that would require a different typeset or language setting in the bibliography. I will say it also became a challenge across the volume to standardize spelling of individuals, of texts. And again, one of the real admonitions of a number of the authors was that we can't simply reduce ourselves to translate titles of texts into English. So the Shahnameh, if we translated it every time to Book of Kings, well, that wouldn't be useful to an Islamicist or a specialist in Persian literature. So we decided very early on that all titles would be given in the original medieval language or the language of the text as it's been accepted in scholarship, so that we will say in every instance Shahnameh and then parenthetically Book of Kings. And that also allows for ease with researching. If a student or any reader picked up the volume, came across the Shahnameh, they could Google or do a bibliographic search on the Shahnameh and more easily find that textual tradition. Whereas Book of Kings could reveal a range of sources that are not central. I will say that within those 11,000 resources, there are hundreds of medieval texts that are described, and I'm working towards putting out in a blog post on the Getty's website, the Iris, that will list all of those texts that we describe with a short summary of when the text was written, who wrote it, and the basic ideas in the text, which will range from anything from the Quran, the Torah, the Bible, to Shahnameh or the Livre des Faits d'Alexandre le Grand. All of these ideas will come forth in a future resource. So the project is not done. It was epic, as you said.
Right. Excellent. Okay. And I think, it's maybe similarly throughout the book, you include a variety of dating conventions, BCE and CE, but also BH and AH. I'm wondering if you could just kind of briefly talk about the dating conventions used in the book as well.
Definitely. That was another really good and fruitful conversation across the authors. In the end, we decided to look at textbooks in a range of fields and to see what conventions are being used. And BCE and CE, although problematic in some ways, in kind of, as Byron Haman says, chronologizing with a hammer, compressing time to a sort of supposed common era that is still centered on a Christian or Judeo-Christian worldview of, the life of Christ. But it was clear from our Islamicist contributors that we needed to also include the dates of the Islamic calendar with the anno of the Hijra. And we could have included innumerable other dating conventions. And in some instances, authors would say 500 years ago or 500 years before the writing of this volume as a way to signal a time 500 years before 2019, for example, when this book is printed, without committing to a dating convention. So there were other strategies for going in line with, but also subverting, perhaps. And I think more work can be done to that degree. But also acknowledging that we couldn't simply choose 500 to 1500 as a sort of firm cutoff. So that's why a number of the authors added a few more words to their essay to just expand about the chronology of their given region or area of specialization. And then in the intro, I tried to lay out these various conventions in different ways so that readers are at least attuned to thinking about the way in which time and mapping and perspectives in writing all sort of contribute to a worldview, and how we have to constantly rethink or recenter those views.
Right. Excellent. Okay. So I'd like to conclude with one last question here. And I think, you've kind of been hinting at some of this along the way. And certainly, as comprehensive as this volume is, it also arrives at some opportunities for further scholarship or further idea generation. So I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe a little bit projects that are coming up, exhibits and/or extensions perhaps of this volume, or anything that is coming down the pike.
Well, I'm excited to say there will be exhibitions on the horizon here at the Getty that continue to push those boundaries geographically, temporally, and so forth. One that I hinted at about the sort of Americas in a broader global context where we are really resisting the term medieval. Earlier this year at the Medieval Academy of America, I was fortunate to speak with a number of other collaborators that I've been working with since the sort of final stages of toward a global Middle Ages, Pamela Troyer, Kim Klimek, Sarah Davis Secord, and Paul Sudelko, for a textbook that we're writing about global connections. And in this case, we are limiting ourselves to a chronology of 500 to 1500. But that volume will come out in the coming year, and we hope that it too will be a great resource for the classroom that is pushing every kind of boundary that you can imagine. And then I began early on in this discussion championing the work of Jerry Heng, and I will say that she has been at the vanguard of all things global Middle Ages, coining even the idea of a global Middle Ages over a decade ago. And she's embarked on this remarkably ambitious project with Cambridge University Press for shorter volumes that focus on themes in a global Middle Ages. And I don't know how much about that project I'm at liberty to talk about, but I will say for all of the listeners, it will be an incredibly rich, multi-volume, multi-authored series that will roll out over the next several years. And some of that information is already being shared on that Global Middle Ages project, the GMAP online. And then, of course, I'm thrilled to be able to share this material in the classroom setting and hopefully move forward with student perspectives and hopefully inspire a next generation or other scholars to move forward in this thinking and should join us on that journey.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to all of that. And Bryan Keene, thank you once again for joining us on the Authority File.
Thank you so much, Bill, for having me. It was wonderful speaking with you.
We just heard from Bryan Keene, editor of a new book published by Getty Publications called Toward a Global Middle Ages, Encountering the World Through Illuminated Manuscripts. Bryan is Associate Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino. And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.